Hi, I'm DuEwa Frazier, and you're listening to Season 2, Episode 35 of Nerdacity Podcast. Today, my guest is award-winning poet Willie Perdomo. Willie Perdomo is the author of Smoking Lovely, The Remix, The Crazy Bunch, The Essential Hits of Shorty Bon Bon, and Where a Nickel Costs a Dime. Winner of the Foundation for Contemporary Arts Twombly Award for Poetry and the PEN Open Book Award. Perdomo was also a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and the Poetry Society of America Norma Farber First Book Award. He is co-editor of the anthology Latínext, and his work has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Poetry, Washington Post, The Best American Poetry 2019, and African Voices. Willie teaches at Phillips Exeter Academy and was recently appointed New York State Poet Laureate. I hope you enjoy this episode. Greetings, Willie.
Greetings.
How's it going?
It's going well, thank you. How are you?
Good, thank you. Thank you so much for joining me on Nerdacity Podcast today. I really want to give you a round of congrats on your latest book, Smoking Lovely, The Remix.
Thank you.
And of course, a huge congrats for your being the new New York State poet.
Yeah, that came as a really lovely surprise. So thank you for that.
That's wonderful. And, you know, Willie, what makes you say that that's a surprise? Because I find it quite fitting for all of your work in poetry and education in New York, being a known icon in the New York City poetry community, prolific author, and certainly someone who is a champion and encourager for new generations of poets. And so what makes you say that that was a surprise?
I think, the news of it came as a surprise. You never, you want to shy away from anything that resembles entitlement, in this world, no matter how much you've done in the art, because you always strive to do more and do it better. But, just when I look at the list that of the previous state poets, I just feel not necessarily surprised, but I feel honored for sure, and feel like, wow, when I think about the journey, I mean, we can do a whole podcast on the journey alone, just from, me growing up in New York City, in East Harlem, and thinking about being a poet as a young boy. And then, I was, as I like to say now, I was a poet in the crew. Now I'm the poet of the state. So
I love that. Yeah, that sounds like a line out of a rap song.
Yeah, it does sound like that. It does sound like that. I got a friend, DJ Jibo, and he's a East Harlemite as well. He's iconic in the music scene, and we used to be on the same softball team for a bar that was called Camaradas El Barrio in East Harlem. And whenever I went to go to the plate to bat, he would call me Poetry at the Plate. So he would say, now he says poetry at the plate. It's not poetry at the state.
That's cool. That's cool.
Yeah,
it's nice to have friends around you who remember when. Do you feel that way?
Yeah, I do. I think mostly, especially when it was announced on social media, and folks from really all over the country, but definitely parts of East Harlem where I grew up were popping up just to send their congratulations, and feeling a lot like you do, that sense of that this was so well deserved.
Exactly.
Right?
So fitting. So
yeah.
Oh yeah, good feels, with that. I know when I saw it on social media, on Facebook, I was like, yes, that's right.
Yeah, there were a lot of people happy. Yeah.
And so, thinking about your current work, Smoking Lovely, The Remix, I really enjoy reading it, and I can hear your voice. It's wonderful because you've got that great, strong, like spoken word tonation. I could just see you at the New Eurekan and all the places you've been, kind of, sharing your work. And so tell me, in terms of, your growth as a poet and thinking about how the work may have changed, or things that have impacted you during this time, at least from your first Smoking Lovely collection in 2004, and then now 2021. It's been 17 years between the two. What are your thoughts about what's changed for you in poetry or creativity, or even building, collaborating with community, if at all?
Yeah, I think the first thing that has changed for me is that I'm slowly making my way toward writing plays. So you'll see in Smoking Lovely, there's a 10-minute play. So I'm just starting to scratch at that to see what I find, because if you look at a book like The Crazy Bunch, or even if you look at a book like, really, if you look at all my books, but most definitely, the essential hits of Shorty Bong Bong, The Crazy Bunch, that there's always more than one voice at play.
True.
There's a narrative art built into the book. There's dialogue that I like to incorporate in my books, and really I get that from Kane, from Gene Toomer, the possibilities of a book not being just one thing. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I think, is the intentionality of listening to who's asking questions about what was it like that summer you played with the Sesta All Stars. That's how Shorty Bong Bong was born. When are you going to write a book about the crew? That's how The Crazy Bunch was born. So I'm a little bit more purposeful in my approach to writing now, and I get a sense that I want to have. I'm looking at things on the stage now. I'm looking at things play out in a scene. I'm asking questions about why are these characters saying these things, and that is propelling me into story mode right now. My poetry has always been narrative driven. It's always been image driven. I think if we look at the Crazy Bunch, I'm trying to do a lot of things with form and lyric in that book. So that is, a testament to my reading and my sense of risk and experimentation, for sure. Smoking Lovely was a sort of reclamation project. It was me coming to terms with a book that I wasn't really sure about, but I had an opportunity to reissue it and make it somewhat new by adding the 10-minute play and adding somewhat of an autobiographical essay. So now I'm experimenting with prose and the relationship that has to how one looks at, one's old work, either with healthy embarrassment, with retrospection, and critically as well. So the thing that's interesting about reissuing a book is that you're still taking a risk, but some of the issues, if you want to call it that, that I was writing about then, are still prevalent today, are still happening today. So the effects of gentrification on inner city communities, the level, if you look at the police brutality in The Crazy Bunch. But there is the thing I enjoy about writing these books is that I always make a space for joy. I make a space for love, and sometimes that might go unnoticed because some of the traumatic parts, some of the parts that are violent, are the ones that are glaring.
Yeah.
So I would think that that what's changed is my intentionality, without trying to make events out of what I write, and my ability to start listening carefully to those voices from the past that visit and have some good questions to ask. The other thing now with I lost two parents in a span of 3 months
Yes.
in 2020.
Sorry to
And
hear that.
yes, thank you. And I'm thinking about my relationship to them, going through my mother's documents, going through her stuff in her apartment when I had to clean it out was revelatory. And in a way that I'm just beginning to understand. So what that means is that as I keep going through her bins and the stuff that she left behind that is now in storage, that I'm in the act of reimagining my mother, reconstructing her, you know, and that presents ample opportunity because the only way I know how to think is by writing,
Right.
you know. So I'm excited about what's to come and what direction I'm going in with the writing.
I love that. And that's a quote right there. The only way I know how to think is by writing. Wow, that's powerful. And I appreciate, oftentimes, Willie, I find that writers can be secretive about their process or about the things that really inspire them, and maybe not intentionally. And so I really appreciate you talking about that process of thinking about your work as heading into plays. As I note here in your current collection, you have a 10-minute play, Mad Funny Style,
Mm-hmm.
with a number of characters' voices who are, imagined to be, on stage.
Yeah.
This is a full thing going on. And so do you think that this particular play here is something that you would expand, certainly with these characters or similar?
Yes, I think so. I think the impetus behind it. I think there was that moment when George Bush was president and he was Junior was president and he was doing a news conference and somebody just got up and threw a boot at him,
Oh yeah, I
if I
remember
remember.
that. Yeah,
Yeah,
that was televised.
right. It was televised, right? And it dawned on me, what would happen if we were in a place like the New Rican Poets Cafe, if we were in a reading environment, and you're in the middle of reading your poem, and some other poet gets up in the middle of your poem and starts reading a poem from the audience, and not even as a sign of, maybe even as a sign of dissatisfaction, disrespect, even
Mm-hmm.
with the poem as a way of protesting. I felt like I read something like this in a novella by Roberto Bolaño. I can't remember if it's a
Mm-hmm.
longer novel or one of his novellas, but he's always writing about being a poet in the world, you
Mm-hmm.
know. So that was one thing. The other thing is that, when you go on stage to read a poem, especially if you're abroad or at a college somewhere, there's always some stuff that's going on backstage that you don't really know about as an audience member, as a part of the audience.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that stuff is a little bit more dramatic than what's happening on stage,
True.
right? So that was something else I'm thinking about. And then the camaraderie. There's a really nice camaraderie, I think, between the character Pablo and Walt, where they dap each
Mm-hmm.
other up and they get each other really excited. It's almost as if one was Muhammad Ali and the other one was Bundini Brown, and they just get hyped up to
Mm-hmm.
go on stage, and that's always a fun way to look at language and what it means to be in a state of performance all the time.
So were you thinking of Pablo as Pablo Neruda?
I mean, there is some play off of those. Yeah, there are some plays off of those names.
Sonia
Yeah,
Sanchez.
maybe. There are some plays off of those names. I would
Right.
be disingenuous to say no, right? But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, there's a play there.
Wonderful. Well, that would certainly be exciting for us to see, and I'm just, thrilled to hear about your exploration of that um, form. And so, Willie, in terms of this past year, 2020 was, heavy. It was a lot. We lost poet Miguel Algarín.
Hmm.
And I wanted to ask you, how did that impact you, just in terms of your history with the New Rican, and certainly Miguel being a serious leader in terms of poetry in New York City and community building and all of that.
Yeah, along a writer's trajectory, there's always a lineage and a tradition that you claim. And I got in was part of that. And I was just fortunate enough to know him and meet him, and on several occasions hang out with him. You know, so when he passed away, it was a shock to the community. But I mean, folks knew that he, was challenged by some illnesses, definitely toward the end of his life. But what was really important for me about I got in was that he really set up what I like to call a blueprint. But he was able to theorize the New Eurekan movement. He was able to break it down as far as the poetics were concerned. He understood that as a New Eurekan poet, I am bringing all my languages to the table. And that's my uptown tongue. That's my native tongue. It's my Spanish origin tongue. It's my formalistic tongue, should I choose to use it. And that's an exciting place to be, where you have more than one color to paint with, as a poet. So he was really important in that respect. The other part was that he understood the value of community and how to build it, so that when the original New Eurekan Poets Cafe was created, it was so that, this group of New York, Puerto Rican poets could come and workshop and try out ideas for plays and read their poems aloud. And it just became what, right into its reincarnation by the late 80s, early 90s, what Allen Ginsberg called the most multicultural place on the planet. And it was electric. And Agarin really was the founder of all that. What people don't know about Agarin is that he was also a Shakespearean scholar. He was also a professor at Rutgers. And, I had the opportunity to go visit one of his classes. And that was an eventful day. It's a day that I'll never forget because, he came to pick me up, and I met him at St. Mark's over there by the Black Square. And then we drove out to Rutgers, and I did this class. And, along the way, he's pointing out the industrial landscape of New Jersey and thinking about toxicity. And at this point, he had been already diagnosed with an illness, and I think he was, and it felt like he was looking at the landscape of Jersey, that industrial landscape for sure, and how people were always connecting it to a level of toxicity. But when he was looking at it, it was beautiful. And it became, I interpreted as him sort of sharing a metaphor with me. And that takes a lot of love. And, one of the titles of his book was Love is Hard Work. And he knew that. So, his passing was impactful in that way. And I think, my only regret was that I wasn't able to see him before he passed. And once I started working out in New Hampshire, I was, away from New York for some years.
Wow. Do you think that this makes me think about nonfiction also, Willie? Do you think that you might consider just a straight memoir, just in talking about your life and influences and the history, your connections to Harlem and Brooklyn and all these histories in the poetry community?
I have no interest at all in a
and people would love to read it.
I have no interest at all in a straight memoir at this point. I think, if you look at my last 4 books, that you can look at some of those elements that hint at autobiography for sure. But I'm more interested in taking the pieces out of one's life and see what the imagination can lend to that,
Mm.
you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm more interested in writing about sort of more than just me. You know, I think the plays or the attempts at writing plays are giving me that opportunity. And even if
Mm-hmm.
I find some remnants of who I am in these plays, it's okay because there are other people that I can inhabit as a
Mm.
voice that
Right.
respond to those remnants. You know.
Sure. And certainly broadens the reach. I would, with the different characters,
Yeah.
people love to relate and see themselves in the characters, and ponder about, which character might you be,
Right.
that kind of thing.
Right.
Um, so that's really cool. And thinking about your collection, Willie, you talk about, as mentioning, sharing, who you are, your history. You talk about your experience arriving at the New Eurekan in fall of 1991,
Mm-hmm.
and you state that these are lessons that you don't learn as a first year MFA student in terms of stepping to the mic, the open mic, and you learn them from what Etheridge Knight called poeting.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wonder, so you learn certain lessons from actually being out in the community, um, sharing your words and being there in front of, which it can be quite intimidating being on that stage for the first time at the New Eurekan with that crowd and all of that. Um, would you give that same advice to poets today on, the education is not so much just being in a classroom, reading poems by poets who've come before you, but getting out there, poeting, and learning from experience, trial and error, and being amongst the community?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think as I get older, right, I still, you know, you think about how you come to being an artist in the world, and that always has to undergo a level of reevaluation. It has to almost be reconfigured in many ways. So to answer your question, yes, I would do that. You know, I think about this New York State poet title, and one of the requirements is that I give readings in. I give a few readings in what they call non-traditional venues.
Mm.
When I think about that, right, I start to think, well, damn, I read in places. The range of places that I read in would be, say, all the way from a bar on the Lower East Side to some postmodern office building in Berlin,
Mm.
right? In an office space that had been reopened that night so that we can go read, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that means that I'm not really in front of traditional poetry audiences that get up in front of a lectern, in a library. It's very quiet and it's very polite. I didn't learn how to read poems that way. I read poems where people like Steve Cannon would shout and read the goddamn poem already, especially if you try to offer too long of a preface to your
Mm.
poem. If you try to explain the poem away. Now, I had already learned that from my first mentor, Ed Randolph, who
Mm-hmm.
was called the Mad Poet in Harlem, because I did that in a reading that I did with him in high school. And he said, you should never explain your poem away. Just go ahead and read the poem and let the audience uh, get the rest. So
Mm.
the lesson there being that the audience also has a responsibility, right,
Mm-hmm.
in the sharing of the poem. The reading in a place like the New Eurekan or at a bar in New York City, where I read poems, you have to read above the clink of a glass.
Mm.
You have
Yep.
to read above the murmur of voices. And there were moments where, I started reading a poem and all that came to a halt. And it didn't
Mm.
happen all the time, but I knew I was hitting some sort of mark where the silence sort of ensued, right?
Mm. Mm-hmm.
So that's part of it. The other part of it is that when you poet out in the world and you read in community spaces, you're sharing the work. But those venues also provide a good editing tool, right? because when you're reading a poem out loud, sometimes you edit on the spot, right? And now you
Yes.
go back to the page. Now, here's the drawback. Here's the flip side of that is that the audience can trick you into thinking that you just wrote and read a good poem, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
it quote unquote sounded good.
Right.
And for that audience, it might be, but if they clap hard enough and they clap long enough, you will come back and write for that same audience all the time out,
True.
thinking that you're going to get the same sort of reception. So the only caveat that I would add to poeting in the world, yes, you must do that, but you must always be steady in your practice
Mm-hmm.
of writing, and your relationship to reading has to be devotional. It has to be targeted. So the reading is really important. I lost a little bit of that in those early years,
Mm-hmm.
because the allure of audience and spotlights can be somewhat seductive.
Oh, sure.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and that
Because you're getting that immediate feedback,
that's
Willie.
right, and
Yeah.
it's gratifying.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so I lost sight of the fact that what really brought me to writing was reading. That I was
Mm.
excited by Down These Mean Streets by P.D. Thomas, that Man Child in the Promised Land was so impactful, that the
Mm-hmm.
selected poems of Langston Hughes really opened up Lexington Avenue for me,
Mm-hmm.
as did P.D. Thomas. That came, just blew me away in its
Mm-hmm.
term, in its look at hybridity, that Gwendolyn Brooks was able to say that if you really want to write poems, all you have to do is look outside your window
Mm.
and all the poems are there. And that the role that music and other arts played in that.
Mm-hmm.
So eventually, it took me about 20 years to go back to school, but eventually I sort of recaptured and reclaimed that relationship to my art, and
Mm.
and to reading as a big part of that.
Wow. That's wonderful, Willie. You just really rounded it out and bringing back to, a poet's education. Um, it's it's on the stage, as you mentioned, but it's certainly your relationship with the reading.
Right, indeed, and and now, having said that, if I was teaching the creative writing workshop, say in New York, one of my prompts would be say, all right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave you standing on this corner for the next hour, and you come back and tell me what poems came to you.
Wow.
But you have to stand there for an hour, and I'm telling you that because I spent countless
Mm-hmm.
hours standing on the corner, not just by myself, sometimes by myself, but
Mm-hmm.
with friends of mine. And this is really where the true storytelling happened.
Mm.
Yeah.
Wow. So deep. That's true. And so, speaking of education, how do you and reading, how do you connect? I know you're an educator, but in various ways, how do you connect your writing with being an educator?
Well, it's a case of the chicken before the egg, right? I'm more of a poet who teaches rather than a teacher who
Who
writes.
who writes?
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. So that's really has to be clear first,
Mm-hmm.
and you try to separate the two, as much as you can, because the teaching is an inspirational and passionate space. It's a professional space,
Mm-hmm.
but when I go into my notebooks or when I close the door to my office and get down to writing, well, that's a dream space,
Mm.
and that dream space cannot be imposed upon by deadlines, assignments, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So there has to be, you know, a separation there. But again, right, I'm a teacher, and I teach to my taste. So there's stuff that I've read that I would like to teach,
Mm.
and that's when you find a nice combination of the two worlds sort of meeting on the same corner.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. And so, Willie, going back to Smokin' Lovely, the remix, I had the pleasure of watching the tribute reading that Haymarket, your publisher, put together of all these wonderful poets, really tributing you and celebrating the release of your book this past June. You selected, I believe, or Haymarket selected a number of poets who really spoke to how you have influenced them. Some who discussed taking workshops with you, reading your work over the years, really looking up to you. What has that been like to go from being a poet who certainly you've been mentored, as you mentioned, Ed Randolph, he's mentioned in your book, and you have a number of other poets over the years who you have been influenced by, and then now you are receiving tribute and hearing the stories of how you've impacted other poets. What is that like?
Well, that just means that I've officially reached elder status, right? that's, that's what that means, right? That I've been around the game for a long time now, and there's at least almost upwards of 3 generations of poets that I've been in contact with by this point in my writing life, and that I've been fortunate enough to have either in a workshop setting or be in conversation with about what that means. But there's that saying that if you want to keep it, you have to give it away.
Yes.
And this is part of me keeping it, to impart what I've learned as a young poet in the world to other young poets as they come about. Because these things come in cycle, and it's the hard part to really impart on a younger poet, that it's really about the long game. It's about where you are 25, 30 years down the line in your writing life. Because I came up, with a lot of poets who hit early, but there was nothing after that.
Right. And so,
Mm-hmm.
so then when you talk about, you said, well, that just means I've reached elder status. But is reaching elder status okay?
Yeah, it has to be. It has to be. Of course, there's a
because some people don't reach that.
No, yeah, this is no country for old men, right? This is no country for old people. You know what I'm saying? Like it can be really unforgiving, right? So the idea of being an elder and what that means in an artistic community is that you are either respected or forgotten, right? So to what extent do you have to stay current in your own work? Well, that just means you have to grow, and you have to keep growing. So again, because I had some really good mentors, Raymond R. Patterson was one of them, and he sent me a couple of letters in the early '90s that I carry everywhere. I mean, not on my person, but if I move from place to place, they come with me.
Wow.
And I keep them close because they're sort of like primers for young writers, right? The idea that one, you are in a constant state of growth, but you can only do that in the dark sometimes, and that's important to know. And then the other part is that you're really telling the same story in each book, so it's almost as if you're writing one big book, right? So that was important. But those lessons, when I write, I correspond with younger poets, and we exchange letters and so on. I find myself picking up some of Raymond's approach to talking to a younger poet, and what that means in the larger world of being an artist, and what does it mean to you? Because to be an artist in the world, it involves a certain amount of dreaming. I'm not talking about what comes with sleep.
Right.
Talking about what you can imagine, what you can envision. And for many, once you give up that dream, you start to die a death in increments. It's slow.
So true.
Yeah, so it's really, really important to hold on to that initial dream, right? Langston Hughes used to call them the dream.
Hold fast to dreams.
That's right. The dream keepers. That's right.
Yes. Thank you for that, Willie. And in terms of audience, are you doing live readings at this point, or how are you staying connected with your audience? Do you feel?
I think the audience just seems to grow, and change with every book. I think Urayon Noel in his introduction made it a point that from first to second book, I was taking a risk of alienating the audience, right? That somehow I was getting away from the audience that I attracted with Where Nickel Costs a Dime and sort of going in a different direction. That's a necessary risk, I think, and you can't always play the same album all the time. You can't always make the same album all the time. The audience is still there. It's growing now. Clearly now with Disappointment as New York State Poet, it gets larger, right? There are more people that gravitate to the work, that understand what you're trying to do with language, with narrative, with the idea of the past coming to the present and playing the work. But the audience is becoming a little bit more specific and almost singular. So in other words, I had a dream with my mother shortly after she passed, and we were in a playground, and I was my age currently, but she was younger. And it wasn't as if we were in the playground together. We were almost passing each other in the playground. And she asked me simply, she said, "Where you going?" And it messed me up, man. I woke up and I'm thinking to myself, where am I going? Right? So now the audience again becomes specific in terms of what am I responding to in the writing? Who's asking that question? Based on who's asking the question, I'm responding in the writing, right? So that's what I mean by the singular audience. As far as the collective, yeah, it's still out there. I just did a reading at the Lawrenceville School in Jersey that was really good. They just created a Center for Race and Justice out there, and this was a soft opening of this center. Some really good people out there, doing some good work, and the students came in and they had some really good questions for me, and the reading, I'm just kind of taking my time with the readings these days, and it feels good. So there's that audience, and then there's the Zoom audience, right? And the Zoom audience is interesting because it's almost as if you don't even need to see me. All I have to do is just mute my video. And I can just, you know what I'm saying? I can just read poems all day long, really, because it makes you have to listen, in that type of venue. So it's interesting again, right? Like the range of audience now goes from the remote to the live, and the range of venue goes from the bar to a Center for Race and Justice is just open. So I'm still in that poeting mode, right?
And I'm sure that gives you energy. You're giving energy, but you're then receiving energy as well, because it's always great to see poets in person. To hear the voice and see the gestures and expressions and how you emote the work and all of that.
Yeah, I think I remember seeing one comment on some Zoom reading that I did, and I had read a couple poems, and there was one poem that I read, and some person on the comment screen said, "You could dance to that poem." So that's what you want, right? You want someone living in your poem, right? And so that's important.
That's wonderful. And in terms of collaborations, Willie, what have been recent collaborations, if any, that you enjoyed, or some that you may be looking forward to? Is New York State Poet, or just in general?
The most recent collaboration was an anthology that I worked on called Latínext. That was also published by Haymarket, and I worked on that with two writers, one poet named Jose Olivares, and another nonfiction writer, Felicia Rose Chavez, who's also a poet. And that was great to sort of, each of us were bringing in voices that we had never heard of, and then suddenly you see a community open up on the page, right? And so that was interesting to see the range of Latinx, Latine poets, Puerto Rican poets, Dominican poets, Caribbean, Spanish-speaking poets coming through Guatemalan poets of all ages as well. But we were looking more toward the younger poets for sure, to give voice to those new and emerging voices. So that was an experience, a learning experience for me. And after that, if I can finish one of these plays that I'm working on and get it on the stage, I'm really looking forward to what that collaboration might look like, because I've only done it maybe once. I've done it a couple times with some really awful, short plays that I wrote in college, I'm sure, but it was still fun, right? The idea of bringing this thing together, and not just doing it by yourself was awesome. So that's something that I'm looking forward to, should and if and when it happens.
Wow, that
Mm.
that certainly sounds exciting, Willie. And in terms of writing for young readers, because I know you've done that as well,
Mm-hmm.
do you have anything in progress as far as children's, teens that you
I
may, you know?
Yeah, at this point, no. I think I've strayed really far away from the picture book world, and I was inspired when I first did it. So almost 15 years ago for sure,
Mm-hmm.
and I thought that it was part of a writer's. Langston Hughes was my primary model for being a writer in this world, who primarily lives off his writing, but that is hard to do. And he was always broke, right? He was always
Right.
complaining about being broke, but
And he
he
had
wrote
some
everything.
sponsors, didn't he? I thought
He
Langston
did.
had.
He had some, early
Mm-hmm.
on in the Renaissance, he had patrons. There was a lot of patronage going on there,
Mm-hmm.
for writers from the Harlem Renaissance, where they had benefactors and they had
Mm-hmm.
stipends monthly and all that. But
Right.
he was very conflicted about that, because
Mm.
um, he, because when you have purse strings attached to your art, you usually have agendas with those purse strings.
Yes.
And those were agendas that he could not abide by when he was writing on, really good bond typing paper and wearing three-piece suits and walking by, Carnegie Hall and the Waldorf and seeing people on the street
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
hungry. And that was something that he could not reconcile. So I don't, there's patronage in the term, the fellowships, and I the Cy Twombly Award that I recently won is an award that comes without strings, right?
Oh, wonderful.
Right, and so
Congratulations,
thank
Willie.
you. And those are the kind of fellowships that you want, where you are free to practice at your art as you see fit, and that you have time to do that. But I do have an anthology in mind for young readers, that I'm putting together right now. But that's about as far as I can say about that.
That's wonderful.
Yeah,
Thank you for sharing that too.
yeah.
We're always excited to see everything that you're going to put out. And so I did want to ask you, as New York State poet, will you be commissioned
Mhm.
to write pieces for certain ceremonies and things of that nature?
No, no, it's a very low maintenance title. I mean, again, you have to do readings. You have to do upwards of, say, 3 or 4 readings in what they call non-traditional venues. And
Mm-hmm.
then there's also the other part that you have to sort of spread the gospel, if you will, of poetry throughout the state, and just share your ideas of that with the New York State Writers Institute. Um, and so that's doable, but it's not a thing of being commissioned. I think it's one of those career appointments that happen when you're sort of mid career,
Mm-hmm.
into the next phase of your writing life.
Sure.
Yeah,
Thank you for that.
yeah,
And so before we get to your reading, which I'm very, very excited about to hear a few poems from your collection, Willie, I wanted to ask you, what, if any, is the poet's responsibility during these times related to social justice, politics, community education, and things of that nature? Any thoughts on that?
yeah. I think on the one hand, you never want to put pressure on your art to do anything but what it does, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
on the other hand, though, because you are living in some really, really chaotic times, um, a time of fear, um, a time of confusion, a time of confrontation. a time of injustice, brutality, racism, transphobia, sexism, ageism, economic disparity. You have some parts of the country that are going up to about 120 degrees on a good day.
Yep.
How do you write to that moment? I think I saw a really interesting conversation with the chancellors from the Academy of American Poets, and Natalie Diaz was one of the poets, and there was something that she said about writing in this time, that it's not about what you've done, it's about what you're doing. And that necessitates being present to the moment, right? And if that means writing to that moment, then so be it. And that was one of the takeaways that I got from the conversation. It's impossible to belong to a tradition or a lineage of poetry that is based on witnessing and not be that witness to your times.
Sure.
So that's what I would say, is that as long as I am doing in this moment what I've been doing and writing to a moment and being present to that moment, then my responsibility is taken care of. I had it's interesting, the relationship between being a writer and being an activist in this world. And I remember a friend of mine who was really really active in the independence movement for Puerto Rico. And they were protesting and they were going to parades and so on and so forth. And I remember, seeing him in East Harlem and saying something to the effect that, damn, I'm not in New York as much anymore because I'm working in New Hampshire, but I really wish that, I could be there with y'all on the front line that way. And he simply said to me, I need you to do what you do. And that's the writing piece.
That's right.
And you let me take care of this part. That's the activist piece. So that means that you have someone in your community that respects and honors what you do. And they need you to keep doing that. That's right. So, having that becomes a mandate. So let me just keep doing what I'm doing.
Exactly.
Right. And it'll speak to whatever it needs to speak to, as long as I'm present.
Indeed. Thank you for that, Willie. And so, do you have a few poems that you can share from
Yeah,
Smoking
definitely.
Lovely?
I have a few here.
Okay.
The first poem I was thinking about sharing was, this is called Franklin Avenue Snack Box. And this was based on this. I wrote this shortly when I moved to Brooklyn, almost, how long has it been? About 20 years ago, 21 years ago. And this was the old Crown Heights. This is not, the Crown Heights of today, where, you could find a wine shop and organic food markets and, in some of these neighborhoods, and eyes in the skies all over and all that.
This is one of the ones I bookmarked, Willie, and I said Brooklyn poem because I like this one.
Oh yeah. This is definitely a Brooklyn poem, and I'm an uptown dude, so me moving to Brooklyn was an anomaly. It wasn't supposed to happen, but it's the irony of all ironies, for sure.
It speaks to your journeys, and you're even more of a New York State poet because of it.
Indeed. And snack box is usually what you would get at one of those Kennedy fried chicken joints. I don't know if they still exist anymore, but you get a snack box and you get like a thigh leg and a bun for like $2 back in the day. So Franklin Avenue Snack Box. London fogs Eastern Parkway. Benches are drenched in colonial dew. You stop at the 99-cent store for some mistoling and get something and wave everybody, and everything costs more than $1. Get something and wave. You cop a ganja sack before beat cops turn the corner. Big Black talking penal jazz. Took a flat 5 last time he was in Sing Sing. The only Puerto Rican flag on the block looks like it's crying. Biggie's oxtails and British Empire heels stomp on the downtown 2 train. Angry nurses curse sick passenger delays and whoever gave birth to that bomboclat boy. Hasidim stride by, African butter soap. Crusty crackheads race pit bulls. Hairdressers take tonic juice breaks. You cradle your single man dinner, a thigh, a leg, and a bun. Waiting for the green light, a schoolgirl reads a gangster who calls her his son.
I love that. Wow.
Yeah, you know, it's weird just thinking that these poems were written 15 to 20 years ago. You know, I'm like, wow. It's just revisiting them. This is called what's this called? This is one of the things when my friends found out that I was a poet after Where a Nigga Costs a Dime was published, they would often start bragging to people in the neighborhood that I was a poet, and you know, the book would show up in the local bodega or the local barbershop, and you know, it came with a CD. So the CD would be playing sometimes in the local barbershop. And then I started noticing that my friends started taking an active role in giving me writing prompts, basically.
All right, you a poet? Okay,
Yeah,
so write
basically.
about
Yeah,
this.
they would be like, write about that. That's exactly right, you know. And so they provided me with all the prompts for at least a couple of years of my life, for sure. And to this point still do, I'm sure, in a way that I don't know. So this is called Shit to Write About. The last time I saw Kryptonite, he had a bottle fight with his girlfriend. He stopped me in front of Gaddafi's and asked me to write something sweet for her. He said it should be something like the poem I wrote for Nestor's girl on Valentine's Day. He asked me to recite that poem. The poem went like this. The longer I look for something to say, the harder I search for another way to show you my love. I don't have a rose or a box of chocolates to send in place of my heart, but I can start with a bouquet of I love you and I miss you. Close your eyes and feel me kiss you. If I could, I would turn into Hallmark and send myself express. But all I have is this poem to show that I love you more than I love you less. Crip yell, yeah, that's the shit I'm talking about. But yo, I want mine to be better than that though, you know what I'm saying? Tell me what you miss about your girl, Crip, I said. He put his hand on my shoulder, looked into my eyes and said, you know how she puts me to sleep? She sings me lullabies while she writes her name in cursive on my back with the tips of her fingernails. She loves it when I run a comb mad soft through her curls. I miss her, yo. He said, like he was lost for the first time. I remembered the night we were standing in front of 1990 and Crip pointed to a cardboard shrine on the corner. And then he pointed to a row of kicks hanging off the long neck of a light post. The glow-in-the-dark rosaries draped on the rims of yellow candles, eternal flames, untapped 40s, unwrapped cigars, tombstones that we visit daily. Now, if you're going to write about something, Crip said, that's some shit to write about. Today, his subject was life stories, unauthorized biographies about players who are reaching the end of their game. Yo, he started, I've been looking all over for you, man. I heard you was living in Brooklyn now. Coño, you getting fat, kid. God bless you. Word up, bro. Last time I saw you, you looked like you were smoking lovely. Not for nothing, but ninjas were saying that you were down with the Dead Poets Society. Kenny Mack told me you was getting paid to write your life story. And like lately, I've been having these scrambling nights and hand-to-mouth baby crying mornings. I just lost my cousin to the monster, and I'm waiting for a formula that I can drink to grow stronger. The boys are blowing us off corners like ghost town dirt. I feel like I'm running from a cage, crying when no one is looking, like every day is going to be the last time I see my son. And then I started thinking, bro, if I wanted to write a book, how much you think my life would be worth?
Wow. This is like a novel. I mean, wow. I could just so see the you and your friend Crip, and so this is one of the prompts someone gave or might have given you.
Right. Yeah, I mean the part about the pointing to stuff really did happen, right? And then the other stuff you start to imagine in bits and pieces, like someone really did come up to me and said, because they heard that I just wrote this book, that somehow I was making money, not knowing that I was poet, you know what I mean? And so that was part of it. And then the other part was, being assigned to sort of witness or give word to how someone else is feeling, because someone thought that I was, I had verse. So that was part of it.
Wow. That was dope, Willie. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So now just tell me, as we close out, where can we pick up a copy of Smoking Lovely, the remix, and how can we follow you and continue to support you and your work?
Yeah, for Smoking Lovely, the remix, it would be cool if you can go down to your local bookstore and maybe have them order the book if they're not carrying it, or go to directly to Haymarket Books. Usually they offer some really cool discounts along this, maybe this title with some other titles as well, if you order in a few books at the same time. And if worst comes to worst, Amazon is always there, and for that and the rest of my titles as well. And my social media handles are all the same. So it's Willie Perdomo across the board: Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter.
Wow. Excellent. Well, Willie, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure
to
talk with you as per usual. And congrats again on all of your recent honors, your book. And I want to mention that Latínext anthology is excellent. And I think I remember that was released in 2020.
Yes, that was released right at the height of the pandemic. Yep.
Yes. And that's also available through Haymarket Books, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Well, great. Well, best wishes on your term and journey as New York State poet, and also with your writing and everything you're doing in education and the community.
Well, thank you, and thank you for all the work you're doing to move the culture along, and I wish you much success as well.
Thank you, Willie. Well, Absolutely. Take care.
Peace.
Peace. And you were just listening to Season 2, Episode 35, featuring poet Willie Perdomo. Be sure to check out Willie's books, including his latest work, Smoking Lovely, the remix, by purchasing at your local bookstore or Haymarket Books. You can also visit Willie's website at willieperdomo.com. Tweet me at NerdacityPod1 and give me your thoughts on this episode. You can also follow Nerdacity Podcast on Instagram at Nerdacity Podcast. If you'd like to support future episodes of this podcast, consider donating at paypal.me/DuEwa World or by visiting anchor.fm/DuEwa Frazier/support. Thanks so much for listening. Take care.